welcome everybody. Hello, my name is Larry Krasnoff. I'm the chair of the Department of Philosophy, or interim chair for just this year. I'd like to thank you all for coming. The students in the PPLW seminar, but all the other students that are here as well. We do have events throughout the semester. If you're not on our major or minor, we do have a list that's called Phil Curious, which basically just tells you all sorts of interesting things that we might be doing in philosophy, whether you're a major or minor or not. If you don't get those emails, say something to me or to Professor DeLone or to Priscilla Thomas right there, who's the administrator in the department. We will get you those emails so you can come not just to this, but to more things. We also have a student club. There's Lily Kirkland right there. She's the director of that. That meets every other Wednesday, but not until next semester, right?
No, our last meeting was last night.
Last night. So, but there's been lots of interesting, exciting meetings. So, do think about that next semester. There are also lots of philosophy courses still to register for it. So if you got questions about that, don't hesitate to come to me or really any of us in the department. I'm basically just going to turn this over to Professor DeLone because he's teaching the PPLW seminar. It's really a nice thing that we do. I think that we always like to have a speaker in connection with the senior seminars that we do. And then the speakers not just come and give a talk to everybody, they come and they meet with the class too, what they've already done. So I appreciate Luke doing that, so extra. So turn it over to you.
Thank you. Welcome, everyone. So my name is Nicolas Delon. I'm assistant professor in the Department of Philosophy, and it's my pleasure to introduce Luke William Hunt, who's an associate professor of philosophy at the University of Alabama, also a former FBI special agent. I talk about that a little bit. He's the author of numerous articles published in journals in philosophy, law, and political theory, and the author of 3 books. The Retrieval of Liberalism in Policing at Oxford in 2019, The Police Identity Crisis at Routledge in 2021, and most recently, Police Deception and Dishonesty in 2024 at Oxford. So that's 3 books in the span of 5 years. It's pretty good. And so today is going to talk about police interrogation in fraudulent epistemic environments. So thank you all for coming. There's a lot of my PPLW students, but also a lot of faces I don't know. So I'm very pleased about that. But take it away.
Yeah, thank you. All right. Well, thanks for that introduction. And again, it's a pleasure to be here. I've been traveling Charleston for years, and I always love to visit the city. It's such a cool place. First time on campus, and it's been really a treat so far. I see a lot of familiar faces from class. If nothing else, I think I convinced your students to watch The Wire. We watched a video clip from The Wire, classic show. I recommend that to everyone. But you see the title of the talk, and let me just say a little bit, I guess, about why a philosopher is talking about policing, right? Because that's a little unusual. I mean, if you think about what philosophers typically do, certainly if you look at the last 50 years, policing has not been a big topic. Fortunately, I think that's changing somewhat. The last several years, there's been some great work on policing from philosophers, and I hope I can make a small contribution to that. So how did I come to this? Well, you just heard a little bit about that. I was an FBI agent before making the natural career change to philosopher, right? That's the obvious next step in one's career as an FBI agent. And so when I was an FBI agent, I had 2 posts, one in the Richmond division. I was in the Charlottesville office. I was in Washington, D.C., Washington field office, and then I spent a little time at headquarters as well. And over the course of working cases, a lot of things I saw were great. I think we were doing good work. On the other hand, there were several things that troubled me. And when I left the Bureau, when I ultimately made that decision, it seemed clear that when I was going to go back and do my graduate work in philosophy, that I wanted to make sense of some of the things I experienced as a law enforcement officer, as an FBI agent. And as you would expect, I haven't written about a lot of what you see regarding policing in the news, so sort of uniformed police officers, patrol, and that sort of thing. I've focused on the law enforcement component of policing, specifically investigative functions, right? Because that's what I knew best. But that being said, I want to be clear that when we're talking about deception and dishonesty, that's relevant to all law enforcement officers, right? There's going to be many cases when a police officer, whether it's state police, sheriff's deputy, local police, a federal agent, either needs someone or wants someone to do something or to get a piece of information. And deception and dishonesty is often an effective tactic to accomplish that end. Okay, so I think this is broadly relevant what we're talking about. All right, so the title you see, let me open with a case study, okay? And then I'm gonna play a very short video clip after this case study, but let me tell you about the facts. So this is a case, a 2014 case, and Wilhelmina Hicks awoke one morning and found her 4-month-old son, Matthew, unresponsive. The facts of the case actually occurred in 2008. So Hicks and her husband, Adrian Thomas, they're distraught. They take Matthew to the emergency room. Blood test shows that their son, Matthew, is in septic shock. Okay, so a subsequent CT scan reveals fluid collections on the brain, and Matthew is put on life support. So he's certainly not dead, but he's on life support, and it's really looking bad. So there's no evidence of skull fracture or anything like that, but an ER doctor indicates to one of the police that the baby may have a fracture and may have been murdered. Okay, so that's all the police have at this point, and they take custody of a very distraught Thomas, the father. They read him his rights, and they proceed to interrogate Thomas for a total of 9.5 hours over 2 sessions. The police repeatedly lie to Thomas. They deceive him regarding several things: medical evidence, legal facts, as well as other facts. For example, they say that, or they falsely represent that Thomas's wife has blamed him for Matthew's injuries. They falsely represent that Matthew is still alive, when in fact, at the point that they make that representation, his son had already died. And they falsely tell Thomas that he could go home if he simply confesses to harming Matthew. Now, eventually after this, Thomas does confess to harming Matthew, and he's convicted. However, he is subsequently retried without the confession evidence, and he's acquitted. Now, you might think, okay, well, justice prevails. But by that point, of course, his wife had divorced him. He'd spent 6 years in prison away from his 5 other children. And it's now clear that Matthew, his son, died of septic shock. So, it's one thing for me to talk about facts. I want to show you a short clip of some of the interrogation. And the reason I have this is because they made a documentary. Someone made a documentary of it. And so I'm just going to show you like 2 minutes, like the trailer from this documentary, so you have a feel.
It's just the law. You're a human being and you got rights.
Well, I'm telling you, I think you're a liar, and you're going to prove it to me.
He killed his son.
The doctor said, just like that.
I swear to God, I didn't do nothing, man.
For someone to be interviewed for 10 hours and then ultimately confess the crime that they committed, I don't think that's abnormal.
Do you think if you accidentally caused this injury that we're going to arrest you? Yes or no? Yes. I'm telling you that we're not going to, okay?
When we're speaking to you, we're of course lying. So we're going to say anything we can to get you to tell us the truth.
My solemn promise, and I haven't lied to you yet tonight, we are bringing you home.
They're just playing it. Because frankly, they don't know why this baby died.
I don't know who could have did what, because when he was in my care, he was fine.
But clearly, the police told falsehood. That didn't trouble me professionally because I know the law tolerates that.
It's a voluntary statement when you got 2 or 3 cops on you.
Who could have done it? Grabbed that baby by the shoulders, smacked him down on top of something, so it fractured the back of the baby's skull.
You call that voluntary, and your son, you've just heard that your son has died.
This case had many holes in it. There's not one broken bone on this child's body.
Once the allegation of abuse comes in, it kind of whites out everything else. It happens frequently.
It's such a contested area in New York State, the area of false confessions.
You gotta find that memory right now, Adrian. You gotta find that memory. This is important for your son's life, man.
They're inviting him to make something up.
But you know what? If you can't find that memory and those doctors can't save your son's life, then what kind of future are you gonna have?
When someone commits a crime, they don't typically walk into the police department and say, hey, detective, I did it, and this is how I did it.
Come on in here and settle this baby down, because I can't do it.
Everything that Adrian Thomas said in this case
Start thinking about them kids crying all day and all night in your ear.
was fed to him.
Your mother-in-law nagging you and your wife calling you a loser.
Everything.
And let that aggression build up. Show me how hard you threw him on that bed.
Okay. Okay. All right. So now you have some images of the suspect who was ultimately acquitted. And you know, when you watch it in a video like this, maybe I should. It's good. You know, there's music playing. Maybe the people who make the documentary have a story to tell. So we can keep all of that in mind, and I hope you do keep that in mind. You heard both sides in the trailer from the police, and then you heard people who are raising questions about their tactics. And I want you to keep all of that in mind, all sides of the story. And I'm going to come back to this case throughout my talk. Okay, so let me give you a little overview of what I'm going to argue here. So we can describe Thomas's confession as having probative value, right? So in other words, the confession is evidence that makes it more likely that the state's going to meet its burden of proof regarding relevant facts in the police's investigation. Specifically in this case, the investigation of a murder. So this is a pretty common scenario. I don't think this is unusual. I think it raises a number of legal, philosophical, practical, epistemological questions. Now, it's generally necessary for the police to establish probable cause before engaging in custodial interrogation. So in other words, when you're questioning someone and they're in custody, you have to have probable cause because typically you would need probable cause to maintain that custody. So custodial police interrogation relies on what I'm going to argue is a fraudulent epistemic environment. So what this means then is that, in my view, probable cause is a sort of evidentiary and epistemic standard that legally justifies the police's use of deceptive and dishonest custodial interrogation tactics that are on par with fraud. So what am I going to say? I'm going to argue ultimately that, look, even if the use of this sort of fraudulent epistemic environment is based on probable cause, norms regarding voluntariness, we talked about this in my class earlier, harm, legitimacy, and bargains, along with consequentialist concerns, support the conclusion that this kind of evidence with probative value, like a confession, should often be excluded when derived from this kind of fraudulent epistemic environment. Now, I think this topic raises several interesting legal doctrines. I know a lot of people, a lot of students at least, are maybe thinking about law school. And I want to mention a couple of these doctrines that are going to be relevant throughout the talk. And what I think you're going to see is, at least in my view, you can tell me what you think, there's a disconnect between, on the one hand, sort of basic conceptual analysis of the terms that we're going to be talking about here, on the one hand, and on the other hand, how courts have construed these doctrines. Okay, so the first one, most people will be familiar with. Privilege against self-incrimination. So where does that come from? It comes from the Fifth Amendment. So you hear this often when people take the Fifth, right? So it's a privilege that protects us from being compelled to incriminate ourselves, right? So that's a fundamental right we have in this country. The warning requirement, well, how is that protected? Well, you've seen, if you watch any cop movies, television shows, The Wire, the warning requirements, the Miranda, you get Mirandized, right? You probably can say at least part of it by heart. You have the right to remain silent, et cetera, et cetera. And one interesting thing about that we'll talk about throughout the move forward is that it identifies one specific harm very explicitly. If you talk, it's going to be, or it can be, used against you in court. It could be extremely harmful to you. There's a harm potentially in the background there. The exclusionary rule. Now, the exclusionary rule, you may know, prevents the state from using some evidence gathered in violation of the Constitution. So it can be thrown out if it's a violation of the Constitution. A big one here, probable cause. Well, that's an evidentiary requirement. You've heard that a lot. I don't know, how many of you have actually thought about what probable cause means? I wonder if you could articulate. Well, it just means police get to do something. They get to go get a warrant, right? Well, what does it actually mean? Okay, so it is an evidentiary requirement that makes it necessary for, the police to, or it's required for the police to make an arrest, conduct a search, receive a warrant, and so on. And it's based on this idea of reasonableness and fair probability. So courts have been kind of reluctant to put, a number on it, right? But they've made it clear that it's something less than a preponderance of evidence. In other words, proof that a fact is more likely than not true. So it's probably does not require an over 50% likelihood, but it's more than, say, reasonable suspicion, which is, by the way, the standard that the police use when they stop you on the sidewalk and they frisk you and pat you down because they have reasonable suspicion of criminality. That's a different topic. We can talk about that later if you like. Voluntariness principle. This is crucial here, and I'm going to say a lot about this. So this is a legal standard. Now I'm going to push back on the legal interpretation, but the basic idea is that, look, confessions need to be voluntary admissions. So they have to be made freely without being threatened, promised benefits, and so on. And then finally, fraud. I'm just going to, for a placeholder, say right now that that's deception and dishonesty used to gain an unjust advantage that injures the rights of others. Okay, so keep all of that in the background. We can come back to it throughout the talk. Now let's talk a little bit. You might find this interesting here. How does police interrogation work? Yeah, it works in quotation marks. So it works, it does something. I don't know if it's the thing we want done, but it certainly does something. So some of this I can attest to because I was taught some of these tactics at Quantico. So when you go to Quantico, the FBI Academy, you learn all sorts of stuff. Primarily you're doing a lot of shooting, defensive tactics, you're learning about the law, but they also have courses. It's like this. You sit in a classroom just like this. You learn how to interview. You also learn how to interrogate, right? So how do you interrogate? Well, what you don't do is, get a phone book and beat someone over the head until they give you what you want. That's not permissible, right? The first thing you really want to do is kind of change the narrative. So you want the suspect that you're questioning to think that the situation is different than it really is, right? You want to mitigate the severity of what's going on, right? You want to give them excuses for why they may have done what they did. You want to downplay it. You want to show that you can sympathize with their scenario. And you want to say, look, there's a way out of this and we're going to get out of it together, right? You change the narrative. And you can see in that video that I showed and in the description of the facts, that there was some of that going on. So what did the interpreters or the interrogators, repeatedly say? They say, look, we understand that your son's injuries were accidental. You didn't do this on purpose. This is an accident we're investigating, right? look, we're not looking at what we think is a crime. And if you'll just tell us what happened accidentally when you harmed your child, you can go home. No one's going to be arrested. So you change the narrative, right? You make them feel that they're in a different situation than they are in fact in. Now, is that all a bunch of BS? Yes, of course it is, right? And that's deceptive. Whether it's justified or not, we haven't gotten there yet. Okay, what about false facts, as I described it? Well, think about the Thomas case we just referred to again. So when Thomas continues to deny that he hurt his son, even accidentally, well, what do the police do? They switch gears, right? They say, look, we're going to take the hardball approach now. Your wife said that you did it. She blamed you. Was that true? No, that was not true. That's a misrepresentation of fact, right? So that's a fact. Now, you might be saying, well, wait, is that okay? Well, yes, it is okay, but we can get there. Hold on. They also say, look, if you don't take responsibility right now, we're going to scoop up your wife from the hospital and bring her here because one of you must have injured the child. Is this a one-off thing, do you think? Should I just give you like a shocking case? No, of course not. I wouldn't do that. Anyone, a lot of you aren't old enough to remember this. You've probably heard of it though. You've heard of the Central Park 5 case, right? That's another classic example. So 5 teens, I was a kid, I was young, this was in '89, but I was around, were arrested, and the allegation was they brutally raped, assaulted a woman who was jogging in Central Park, right? Brutal attack. The woman was unconscious. I don't know, for days, weeks, and when she finally came to, she couldn't remember anything about the attack. So during the interrogation of these teens, we had some of these false facts going on, right? So one police officer, for example, said, well, how can you say you weren't involved? Well, we've got fingerprint evidence. We've got fingerprint evidence. We have the woman's underwear. We have fingerprints. So not only did they not have the suspect's fingerprints, they had no fingerprint evidence at all. Just made up, right? And if you don't know this case, I'm sure you do, but they were convicted, went to prison for a long time, and ultimately were released because they found the actual rapist who had committed several crimes while they were, the wrong people were in jail. The next one, false laws. Now, this is one that you might not have heard as much about, but I find it pretty fascinating. So in the Thomas case, although the interrogators later acknowledged in a hearing, they didn't even have legal grounds to hold Thomas. They told him that they were his last hope at forestalling criminal charges. In other words, they lied about the legal severity he was in, right? They lied about his predicament. And so in other cases, it's even more egregious. Well, again, depends on how you view these cases. Let's say, for example, here's a case that I've written about a little bit. Let's say, I'm going to change the facts just slightly, but let's say a 20-year-old guy has sex with, what age do we want to say? We'll say, let's say 16. And let's say they consider themselves girlfriend, boyfriend, whatever. Now, when the father of the 16-year-old girl finds out about this, they go to the police go to this guy, they bring him in and interrogate him, and they say, look, this happens all the time. You guys are not that far apart in age. And if the sex was consensual, there's no crime here. It's not going to be, or if there is, it's going to be some misdemeanor. It's not going to be rape. So the guy confesses. Well, come to find out, that was a blatant misrepresentation of the law. Statutory rape, guys go into prison for a long time. Now, maybe you think that's okay. I mean, again, I'm not trying to influence that. I'm just telling you that's what I would describe as a false fact, a misrepresentation, or law, a misrepresentation of one's legal situation. Okay, so by the end of all of this, in the Thomas case, he does, quote, take the fall for his wife. He said he didn't harm his child, didn't believe his wife did either, but he wanted to take responsibility to keep her out of trouble. Okay, that's how this stuff works. Now let me say something about this idea of a fraudulent epistemic environment. I'm going to read a quote. So for you philosophers, we'll get a little more philosophical. I'm going to read some H.L.A. Hart, the concept of law, classic legal philosopher, and then I'll kind of give it some context in a bit. This is from Hart. It is a truth of some importance that for the adequate description not only of law, but of many other social institutions, a place must be reserved besides definitions and ordinary statements of fact for a third category of statements. Those the truth of which is contingent on human beings and the world they live in retaining the salient characteristics which they have. Now, why did I read this passage? I like it a lot because it reminds us, I think, obviously, that any plausible theory about law and social institutions such as the police must be receptive to some very basic empirical generalizations about the way the world is and about the way people are. And one of those empirical generalizations, as we'll see, is that people are vulnerable. We have these just inherent human vulnerabilities to physical harm, but not just physical harm, right? To being misled, to being manipulated, not trusting what other people are doing. So if you're a political philosopher, you might read Hobbes, for example, and you know about the state of nature, right? So what does Hobbes think the rational thing to do? Is to defect, because you can't trust. There's no institution to make sure that you're not having the wool pulled over your eyes, right? So if we have a legal institution, a social institution, that is fundamental for it to be viable. So here's some silly examples that I think might help make the point. So we're over here in Charleston by the water. Suppose I kayak. I don't even know if you can kayak around here, but suppose you can. Can you? Okay. Suppose I kayak to a small uninhabited island. So there's lots of things I can do to acquire knowledge about the risk of rip currents, right? So I can get out of my kayak. I can wade in the water, in the ocean, use my senses to acquire knowledge, right? That's how I become acquainted with the risks and so on. But on the other hand, to survive in a political society, we've got to be able to rely on our relations to others. We can't just acquire knowledge on our own. So if I step on the beach near the hotel, I've got to be able to rely on, say, that flag warning system. They have in Florida. I don't know if they have the flag warning system here. Well, in Florida, at least they do. And if there is a double red flag, I could be arrested or fined for entering the water. So I don't have the option to rely on my direct experience of the world to determine whether swimming is safe. If the flag, on the other hand, is green, I've got to be able to rely on the state's representation that the water is relatively calm and I'm not going to be arrested for entering the water. This would be what I would describe as a reliable epistemic environment. So, in my view, any viable political and legal system requires an epistemic environment that entails some degree of trust, mutual forbearance, to account for some of the human vulnerabilities that are just inherent in people. So this includes not just physical, as I said, but fraudulent relations, right? Situations in which a person or an entity uses deception and dishonesty to gain an unjust advantage, and it's regarding a material component that injures someone's rights and interests. So we can see this, I think, pretty clearly in a variation. So imagine the state lacks revenue. And they say, look, we're going to charge a fee to access this beach that you all go to. So you have to pay to go to the beach. And suppose further that the state misrepresents the ocean's conditions to encourage better beach attendance, right? So you're going to generate more revenue that way. So you might fly a green flag when it really should be a yellow flag or something like that. So if I agree to pay that fee and swim based on the state's representation, and I'm harmed, the responsibility for my decision to swim is mitigated by the state's fraudulent misrepresentation. I think you'll see another context where this happens, maybe policing for profit. There's all kinds of analogous scenarios. But as we're going to see in the next section, this decision to pay the fee and swim does not qualify, in my view, as voluntary or consensual given the fraudulent epistemic environment. Okay, so let's talk a little bit about this idea of voluntary relations and responsibility. This is a big topic, covers a lot of different areas, not just policing. But I'm going to take a passage from classic work by Joel Feinberg, Harm to Others. And there's this voluntariness principle. And basically it says, to one who has consented, no wrong is done. So if you consented, it's on you, right? Most people take that as being relatively uncontroversial. However, that principle is most plausible when it denies title to complain only to those whose consent was fully voluntary. And a person's consent is fully voluntary only when he or she has not been threatened, misled, lied to about relevant facts, nor manipulated by subtle forms of conditioning. And this last part, it's worth emphasis here that both force and fraud can invalidate consent. So if you're skeptical here, let's think of some very straightforward examples where your intuitions might be pumped the other way. So I'm going to talk about the domain of, in the sexual domain, but we're going to expand that. First claim I want to make, if A's act is based on B's fraud, then A's act is not voluntary and consensual. Let's give some examples. Well, what about professional fraud and consent? Suppose a physician, a medical doctor, or other professional advises a person that sexual consent is needed for, say, a medical operation or diagnosis. This is not particularly uncommon. Remember what was the guy's name? The gymnastics coach. I mean, I don't know if he was a medical doctor, but he was a trainer. Similar kind of thing. What's that? Yeah, similar kind of thing I think going on there. Now, if there's consent, we put that in quotation marks, obviously we don't think that's morally binding consent, right? Or think about sexual theft. Maybe you think it's more controversial, I don't know. A person agrees to pay a sex worker money in exchange for sex, but then refuses to pay after the sex occurs. Now, is that consent morally binding? I think there's obviously some serious questions raised there. Finally, abuse of authority, formal authority. So a person uses their formal authority, such as, for example, law enforcement authority, and unfortunately we have many cases of this, to leverage sexual consent. So, for example, and I've written about this, so a police officer stops someone, maybe they're poor, maybe they're on drugs, maybe they've got a lot of baggage. They say, look, you got two options. You know, you can go to jail or you can do this sexual act, right? Now, if they do it, say, okay, I'll do it. I agree to do that. That's another way of saying I consent. We don't think that's morally binding consent, right? I mean, okay, just so we're on the same page here. Now, let me give you a little more of a complicated case. So this is a case, it's a real case, not a hypothetical. So in this case, the police ask a woman who's facing a drug charge, right? So this woman's facing a drug charge. So, you know, I don't know how much you guys know about policing, but, you know, when someone's facing something like a drug charge, that gives you leverage as a police officer, right? You can have a little bit more control on what they agree to do and don't do. So they say, look, we are investigating this guy, and we think you're going to be able to help us in our investigation. So here's what we want you to do. We want you to engage in oral sex for money with the target of our investigation. In other words, an act of prostitution, which would be illegal and which would give the police leverage and evidence against their target. Okay, so the police's goal, again, to get this evidence, and the woman agrees. She says she'll assist the police given the prison sentence she's facing. And so the police provide her with a recording device, a napkin, recording devices to record that. And the napkin is for gathering physical evidence from the sex act. I'm not going to go into more detail than that. And the fascinating thing and the shocking thing to me about this case, again, I don't expect you to have the same reaction, but you may not. That leverage the police had over the woman. You remember that drug sentence? They said, look, you're facing 40-year prison sentence, 40 years. In fact, the woman was facing only a 6 to 10-year sentence. So in my view, no one's going to sue the police for fraud in that case. But her consent, sexual consent to engage in that act to help the police, was based on a fraud. Police use their leverage by saying, you're going to face 40 years in prison, or you can do this, your choice, I'm not forcing you. But in fact, there's a material misrepresentation of fact. She was facing potentially 6 years. So from that, the next premise of the argument would be something like, if person A's act is not voluntary and consensual, then A should not be subject to harm resulting from that act. So, conclusion of this mini argument, if A's act is based on B's fraud, A should not be subject to harm resulting from A's act. So let me recap with a couple of points here. Remember, custodial interrogation typically requires the police to satisfy the evidentiary burden of probable cause, because you need that for an arrest. Now, that custodial interrogation, as we talked about, also requires a Miranda warning. And that identifies a type of harm very explicitly. Remember I said that. Anything the suspect does or say can be used against them in a court of law. So if one's decision to open oneself up to that sort of harm is based on a fraud, arguably, in my view, one should not be subject to the resulting harm caused by one's confession. So what's the upshot here? That the harmful evidence obtained by the police fraudulently should be excluded, even if it has probative value. In other words, even if it supports a conviction. All right, so some objections. Maybe you have a lot of objections. I'm going to read another quote just to inject a little more philosophy here from Shauna Schifrin. And she writes, if we are indeed engaged in epistemic moral cooperation and take advantage of some division of labor, it would make sense that we would locate some sources as epistemic authorities, that is, sources we can and should be able to rely upon for information and judgment about our moral, political, and legal duties. And at this point, you might say, well, yeah, if we can't trust the police to tell us our rights, our responsibilities, what our legal situation is, who can we trust? And maybe you think, well, that's naive. Of course we can't trust the street. If that's your view, then that just shows how bad the problem is. Okay, now there are going to be objections. And the central objection here is the priority of law enforcement. Now, I'll be the first to say, coming from a law enforcement background, I'm a fan of law enforcement, right? I want the law enforced. I think that's a good thing. Does it outweigh the concerns we've raised? Well, you might argue political institutions like the police, they can do this sort of fraudulent epistemic environment because it facilitates law enforcement. I just said I like law enforcement, so don't I want law enforcement? So maybe a person should be subject to the harm that is put on them, even if it's based on a fraud, given the goal of law enforcement. Well, how would I reply to this? Okay. So in addition to epistemic standards, there are normative constraints based upon the means by which the police enforce the law, right? So let's give some easy examples. No one, I hope, although I want to say no one because I was just talking to my dad. I think he'd be okay with this. But and if you all are okay with it, let's talk it. We'll talk about it in the Q&A. What about torture? What about brutality? If that gets us the truth and we find out who murdered the person, we typically don't say torture and brutality are okay. And I think most people don't want to go down that road. I don't even think that's controversial for most people, right? Why is that? Well, we have commitments to political and moral conceptions of personhood, right? So whatever you think about the meta-ethical or metaphysical status of these things I'm going to say, as a matter of political morality, we conceive of people as moral agents who can reciprocate, have human dignity, and so on, which gives rise to some further, more fine-grained components of political morality, namely governance by rule of law, legitimacy. Those things preclude fraud, right? Norms of contracts and bargains. So remember that woman who was lied to about the leverage the police had over her? That's a contractual arrangement. The police say, hey, we'll offer you this consideration for your sentence if you do this for us. It's a bargain for exchange, but it's based on bad faith and fraud. We have norms against that, right? There are also consequences to worry about in addition to these sort of principles of political morality. So for example, false confessions, convictions, as in the Thomas case, or again, the Central Park 5 case. You don't have to take my word for it. The data is collected. There's empirical data. You can go to Innocent Project or wherever and look at the data on this. Another consequence, what about just something a little more nebulous, amorphous? What about the erosion of legal trust? In other words, trust in legal institutions such as the police. What about the erosion of trust, the erosion of legitimacy? I think empirical work bears this out as well. So, just anecdotally, I mean, look at what's been happening in the last few years. There have been big movements to not only defund the police, but to abolish the police. I'll say right now, I don't agree with that, but my gosh, if you don't think there's a crisis of trust and legitimacy, well, I think that's pretty good evidence that there is, right? And so I think that's a pretty significant consequence to think about. Now, a caveat to my argument, and then I'm going to move a little more quickly. I want to make sure we're good on time. Now, this came up a little bit in the class discussion, but I assume that some uses of police force and violence are clearly justified. So here's an easy example. You have an active shooter in a school. Best thing in the world would be to shoot that person as quickly as possible to take them out. Now, I don't know if you find that controversial, but I don't think that's controversial. I think it's pretty straightforward. And I think that's a clear case. Clear case. Now, there's tough cases we talked about in the classroom today. But can we say that whenever force would be justified in law enforcement investigations, for example, to protect a victim from harm, make an arrest, and so on, a fraudulent epistemic environment would also be justified? I think something like that is right. So what I'm going to assume then is that the police's use of a fraudulent epistemic environment is justified in those rare cases in which it might be necessary to address an acute risk of harm to a person. So what are some examples of that? Just really quickly. I gave this example in class, so forgive me, you'll have to hear this again. So when I was in the FBI, we talked about the bank robbery case. We had a serial bank robber going up and down the interstate, violently robbing banks at gunpoint. Someone could get hurt very badly or killed. Fortunately, no one had been hurt. Like 3 or 4 banks were robbed. And now I'm going to tweak the facts a little bit so I don't speak too directly about a case I was involved in. But let's suppose that the FBI, or we were working with local state police as well, so we can be inclusive here. Let's say that the police have a suspect in mind, and they say, look, this guy's got a brother, and they're pretty tight. Let's bring the brother into the interrogation room. And in that scenario, if you have reason, and we have to figure out the epistemic standard. If you have reason to believe that that brother knows where the bank robber is, I think that's getting close to the kind of case that could justify that fraudulent epistemic environment. Why? Because there's an acute threat of harm that if you don't find this guy, like now, someone's going to get potentially shot in an active bank robbery spree that's going on in the real world. Something along those lines. How are we doing on time? We got to be done at 5:45.
5:45, yeah.
Yeah.
Okay, I'll just say a couple of more things and then I'll wrap up.
Okay.
Yeah. Okay. Last thing I'll say here on this point, the kayak example, I mean, you can give a slightly variation of that, but suppose that the state is doing their thing correctly. They're putting up flags accurately, but some bitter local residents who don't like tourism are stealing the flags and putting fake ones up. Well, you might think in that case, the police could lie to find the culprits. And I think that also would be an example where you might be justified engaging in fraud, because if you're creating a situation where someone could be harmed, seriously, you could drown, right? These are active threats. So that's another example. Okay. Last thing I want to talk about here are some policy implications. I'm going to talk about this last case just so you know what we might have to deal with. So let me give you this example here. This is based on a real case. Suppose the police have sufficient evidence to charge a murder suspect with the murders of 2 people. Okay? They've got tons of evidence. The suspect confesses when faced with this overwhelming evidence. Now, the police also believe that the suspect committed a 3rd murder, but they don't have evidence for that. They don't have strong evidence. So what do the police do? They say, look, if you don't confess to this 3rd murder, we're going to ensure that you get the death penalty. Now, in fact, the death penalty no longer exists in that state, but the suspect doesn't know this. So he confesses, he provides detailed descriptions of the murder, the 3rd victim, the location of the body, and it's all corroborated. Now, clearly that's, I think, would constitute a fraud under my analysis. Should the police have refused to search the location for the body because the suspect provided information in a fraudulent epistemic environment? Or after the body is located, should they refuse to disclose that it was the suspect who provided information? And I would say, of course not. And saying otherwise would rightly be met with some sort of incredulous stare. It would be perverse to act as if there's no evidence in those kind of situations. But there still remains a question about whether the suspect should be harmed by that evidence, considering that it was a product of a fraudulent epistemic environment. And my answer is still no, according to that view. And if we say otherwise, then it really undermines this idea that you have a right to voluntary admissions, to remain silent. And ironically, it's not as outrageous as you might think. There's legal doctrine that would sort of be parallel to this. So for example, the fruit of the poisonous tree doctrine. If you get evidence based on an illegal search or an illegal confession, you don't get to use that evidence against someone, right? Now, there are ways to get that evidence in for example, if the evidence could have been discovered by a source independent of the unlawful activity, or if the police acted in good faith. They didn't intentionally deceive someone, but they acted in good faith. So, and I think those cases as well would be consistent with my argument, because the suspect would have been harmed anyway, or in the case of the police making a good faith mistake, the police didn't act with intention, and intention is, of course, fundamental to fraud. This truly is the last point, because I think you might be thinking, well, all right, so this is problematic. Are there ways to address this in the real world, or is this just ivory tower stuff? Well, there are ways that you can reform this sort of thing. It's not hopeless if you think it's a problem. And I think that gets to this issue of democratic policing. You know, the citizenry, you all, can implore your elected representatives to enact legislation prohibiting law enforcement from using the kind of tactics that I've described. And in fact, you see that second bullet there, several US states have enacted this kind of legislation. Now, it's been focused primarily on minors, so you can't lie to minors, make promises to them, and so on, but that could certainly be expanded. You could also make exclusion of evidence part of this rule. So there are ways to do this, and states have done this in recent years. I believe Illinois, Indiana, Oregon are a couple of states that have done this. So the tentative conclusion here, you know, even if the use of a fraudulent epistemic environment is based on probable cause, we have these important norms, and they hopefully mean something. Norms regarding voluntariness, harm, the nature of contractual bargains, along with these important consequentialist concerns that suggest, in my view, evidence derived from fraudulent epistemic environment should be excluded. And, you know, if you think about it, you take a step back, you might say, look, there's not a lot of point to deferring to the police. The police as an institution, officers in general, if they don't operate in a reliable epistemic environment. In other words, if they enhance human vulnerability to things like fraud and so on, acting in bad faith, defrauding people, and undermining the rule of law. So in addition to reaching verdicts that are likely to be true, considering epistemic theorizing, the law is also concerned with reaching verdicts that are fair and just. Okay, that's all I have. So thanks very much. Take it off that.
Hey, thank you.
Embarrassing.
Do you want to field your own questions? Do you want some help from me?
I can field them, that's fine.
All right, we have about 20 minutes for question.
A lot of you ask questions in class.
Yeah.
So you might have got all your questions out. Yeah.
In the beginning, like the video they were talking about how they investigated him for 9 hours and there's 2 separate investigations, right? And they told him both times that his like kid wasn't dead.
Yeah, so yeah. Let me tell you the facts as I understand them, and you can tell me if you have a question about it. So it did occur over 2 sessions. I think at one point they stopped because he had expressed he was so distraught and depressed, it appeared that he wanted to kill himself, right? And they had stopped and restarted. And initially, they represented to him that his son had not died. And that occurred at one point after his son was already dead, because they thought that would be more effective in getting the confession. Because, for example, if your son's still alive, and the doctors are doing their best to save him, it would help to know exactly what happened, right? And I think that was a reason they wanted to lie about that, because they thought, well, look, if he knows the kid's alive, maybe he'll talk and tell us what happened, but if the kid's dead, he's just gonna shut down. So that's that, and you know, you tell me what you think, but that strikes me as pretty cruel.
What the incentive is to keep pushing on like that particular person if they have little to no evidence going into it. To interview the dad for 9 hours and use all of these tactics with like little to no evidence, it just seems really odd to me. So is there any reason why apprehending that person specifically in like a really quick turnaround, is that like a part of policing? Like you really want to catch somebody, whether or not they did it's not that important. Do you really want to catch them very quickly? Like are there incentives like that within the system?
Yeah, that's a great question. I mean, I think in this case, you had, the child die in his home. There's two people there, mother and father, and the suspicion is going to naturally shine on them. The problem is, and this happens a lot, sometimes the police, law enforcement, whoever, put blinders on, and you have one theory of the case. And that drowns out all the other possibilities of what could happen. And it seems like that's what happened here, is that they said, look, this guy, he had to have done it. Were there other factors that would other people have been treated differently if he was more fluent or something like that? I don't know. But they put blinders on and they just would not let go of that theory. And I mean, I think ultimately, I don't want to paint with too broad of a brush, but, you can say the police were motivated by justice. You can say the police are motivated by convictions, confessions. And I think sometimes you just want to get that confession. It's a victory. And we talked about this in class. These tactics are pretty effective at eliciting confessions. Whether they elicit the truth is another question.
Jennifer, and then we'll have it.
Oh, thanks. Yeah, that was so wonderful. All your work is so wonderful. You're making me realize that the suspect is in what Aristotle would describe as ignorance and acting from ignorance, which I had never thought of a case like that before, but they're made irrational and they're being lied to. So the situation is being lied to. So they would be off the hook, according to Aristotle, for two reasons. And I'm wondering why you think the virtue of the police officers doesn't ever seem to be a factor. Like, is there some way to resist the assumption that if you lie, it has a long-term effect on you, on your reasoning, on your outlook, on your psychology? I mean, I know you must know the data on PTSD and things like that from just typical police work. Like, why is that not a focus at all?
That's a really great point, because here's why too. I mean, if you look at, I agree with you, because look at the police institution as a whole now. So are you familiar with this concept, the blue wall of silence? Yeah, so the idea there, I think, is that you don't tell the truth, even if something bad's going on, because you're protecting your own, right? And it's doing something to the institution. It's suggesting that the honorable thing to do is to lie, even to protect bad actors. So it is I think there's this connection. Because lying is part of the job, it's permeating through police culture in general. And if anyone thinks the blue wall of silence, it's not a real problem. It's a real thing. I mean, it is a real thing. And I think to your point about virtue, I mean, how could there not be a deep connection there when we sanction and teach people to be deceptive and dishonest, and then, oh, surprise, when we don't want them to be deceptive and dishonest, they are, because that's considered, an honorable thing to do. I think another way to look at it, I mean, a more straightforward answer is that people just feel that, police specifically, that you can't do your job without getting your hands dirty. And we can't successfully get convictions and confessions without getting dirty. And one argument would be, Well, it may be more difficult, but there may be some cases we don't convict on, we don't get the confession on. And it just is a balance between, do we consider these rights? Do we consider a trustworthy institution important? And you have to weigh those things. And I think the weight has been held on, you got to get your hands dirty. Yeah.
Was there another question in the back? Okay.
Well, first of all, thank you, Mr. Hunt, for the lecture. Obviously, it's been very beneficial and educational as well. I'm sure that we can all agree that, you know, in most forms of deception, it kind of like undermines like a public trust when it comes to the police force. And my question to you is that with the many amounts of deceptions in terms of like confessional cases that led to wrongful convictions, does the legal system kind of like adequately address the impact of these police deceptions on these wrongful convictions? Like, are they ever like kind of like held like accountable to that standard, or is it kind of just you know? All right, well, we'll get this.
So this is a little bit, well, so two ways to think about this. So I know there are some cases in which people have sued, and you know, typically when an institution has grossly violated someone's rights, there may be a way to sue. And so some people who have been wrongfully convicted have had some success there through civil litigation. But I think the bigger answer to this is, in spite of the fact that we have this sort of vast number of wrongful convictions and confessions, the legal doctrine has not changed. So legal institutions continue to sanction, courts continue to sanction this sort of tactic, because we talked about this in class a little bit. There is this incoherent, in my view, argument that one can still make a voluntary admission, even in the face of this very deep and profound fraud and misrepresentation. And so there's this facade that, well, you didn't have a gun to your head, or no one beat you, so it must be voluntary. And for the most part, that's where we're at.
Grace?
Oh, yeah, I'm sorry, I had to write it down. I was forgetting it. Thank you, though. Yeah, so what do you think dishonesty being a functioning component of law enforcement insinuates about roles of police power more generally? And then also, what would you say to an abolitionist making a claim that the sort of dishonesty you're outlining here is actually indicative of like a larger dilemma, structural dilemma with policing, as opposed to just sort of something that we can vote to change?
Yeah, so the first question again was, what is it, how does it speak to questions of power more generally?
Specifically pertaining to police officers or any law enforcement.
Yeah, so my view there is that this is a problem of discretion. So police, discretion is important and discretion is necessary, right? So, you know, just a trivial example, you know, the police cannot sanction or cite every jaywalker or every person who goes over the speed limit, right? That would be ridiculous and would undermine justice. So they have to use their discretion, right? They have to decide when they're going to pull someone over, is it necessary or not? And I think in the case of deception and dishonesty, there's likewise been an abuse of discretion. And the police, although they have perhaps legitimate authority, prerogative power to, in some cases, use deception and dishonesty, it's been abused. It's been used in a way that perverts the law. So we're allowing something that's justified, like discretion, to go so far that it perverts the law. And that's how I think of a lot of police problems.
I guess to follow up on that, I would say, what if someone hypothetically arguing for abolition was to say that there's a sort of environment present which is enabling that, and that it's foundationally enabling, and enabling in a way in which it's like too big of a problem maybe to solve.
Yeah, and so maybe we should just burn it all down, kind of thing. Yeah, I mean, so I'll put my cards on the table here. I mean, I understand. Well, I can't say I understand it fully because I haven't experienced it like some people have. So I don't want to speak to other people's experiences. I certainly can't do that. But philosophically, I do have a lot of worry about, the claims that abolitionists have made. And one reason for that is that I'm most concerned about the least advantaged folks. So people like me, who is certainly not rich, but relatively affluent, professor, live in a pretty nice neighborhood. If the police are abolished, I'm probably going to be okay, right? Because people are going to band together and get some private security, and I'm going to be good. My kids are going to be good. Now think about people who don't have those resources. The least advantaged people who are just sort of hand to mouth and are struggling. Now, if the police go away, as much problems as the police may be causing those people in some cases, they're the last line of defense from some pretty bad actors in society. And so I would worry that you would have a very disproportionate distribution of security in society with abolition. So I'm one of those people who say, it doesn't sound very exciting, but reform is better than burning it all down. For that reason. And the last thing I'll say on that, and this came up a little bit, is in America specifically, like it's one thing to look at Denmark or whatever. How many guns we have in this country? More than people. So, just as a social scientific fact, I think it would be a tricky situation here.
More questions? Yeah. Okay.
I had to learn in school that witness testimonies are kind of trusted less and less over time because our memory is easy to manipulate. So they supposedly train investigators, interrogators to not use leading questions. Like instead of saying like, oh, like, did you see a yellow hat? You say, is there anything in the environment that was striking to, I don't know, whatever. So you have to use like more neutral language. Either way, they, in most cases, don't really use witness testimonies anymore because they're so unreliable. Why does that not apply the same way with confessions? I sort of understand, but like if we're using the same kind of deception, then why would that work?
Yeah, I think it's because there's this just gold standard that if someone says, I did it, we're not factoring in that it could be irrational to say I did it. And so once they say I did it, however they got to that conclusion, it's just often overlooked. And, you might say, well, why, and we talked about this in class, why would anyone confess to something they didn't do? Well, again, if the police come out with a box of evidence and it's fake, and you're thinking, what the hell? Like, I didn't do this. Like, where do they get all this evidence? And it's like, and the police say, this is what the jury's gonna see, right? You either confess, you go to trial, and they're gonna get 40 years. You confess now, we'll get you a plea deal to 6 years. That's not irrational necessarily to confess in that situation, right? And so, but once you get the confession, that covers so much because you've got someone saying they did it, right? And that's just a tactic. So the short answer is there's really an emphasis on getting the confession, not necessarily getting the truth.
Legal system, not a justice system.
What have you studied in the connection between, or the disconnection between the educational level of the suspect and the educational level and training of the interrogators?
Yeah, that's a great point. And this is one of my worries is specifically about this, is because, and we talked about this a little bit in class, who is going to be the biggest victim to these sort of tactics? Typically those that are least advantaged, the fewest resources, so you're less sophisticated suspects, right? So if you have someone who's making 6 figures, they're, a sophisticated, educated person, they know their rights, they're not going to be necessarily as likely to be manipulated. So I do think these tactics will emphasize some segments of society more than others. And to your point, relative to compare them to the police, I mean, I remember as an FBI agent just thinking, I'm not proud of this thought, but this is too easy. Like the resources we have, the ability we have when we have someone in this room, it's too easy. And so the odds are stacked in favor of, I think, an agency like the FBI, state police, local police, when you're dealing with some of these suspects. It's not going to be the case all the time. You have some very sophisticated suspects sometimes. But by and large, I think that's a deep concern.
Might have time for one last question. Bryson.
Yeah, so one thing that I was thinking of is that like when a citizen is being interrogated, if they are to lie or manipulate the investigator, like legally speaking, like that, they could be charged for like an obstruction of justice with that. However, it seems like when police like kind of do the same thing or lie and manipulate to someone that they are interviewing, they cannot be held to the same sort of punishment for that. And if we take justice as just like coming to like a correct conclusion regarding who is like guilty versus innocent, I think it kind of reasons that lying to a suspect for the purpose of getting like a confession, regardless of like it being a correct, like a justified, a true confession or whatever. What I'm trying to get at is why do you think there is a gap between the accountability of citizens versus police when it comes to manipulation? And would it just be sort of because of like the institutional role of the police that sets it apart, or?
It's a great question. You're exactly right. So this is the sort of the backup for every FBI agent. Yeah, this 1001 violation, right? You don't have to be in court, right? You lie to an FBI agent, that's a federal crime, right? And it's a double standard, right? So they can lie to you, law enforcement can lie to you, but you can't lie to them. And we could talk forever about that, but we could describe that. Some people are going to say, well, having people lie to state is going to interfere with official investigations. That could be one justification. But on the other hand, you might just say this is an instance of overcriminalization. We have too many laws that make too many things illegal. And just like I can lie to you right now in this classroom and no one's going to put me in jail, maybe I should be able to lie to the police. I don't know. I mean, you tell me. Yeah, go ahead.
You kind of covered it, but I think it's really funny if the police lied to you about the investigation, aren't they also interfering with the investigation? Like if we lie to them, then we're interfering with the investigation and it's going in the proper direction. But if they're lying to you, isn't it? It's the same thing.
It's this paradox because the goal is supposed to be truth, but you're seeking it through untruth, right? So it's this weird paradox. I agree. It's weird.
All right. Well, final round of applause for our speaker. Thank you. For coming.